The power of memory. Minds that see streets as streets and houses as houses and trees as trees. Minds that see things as they are. Before I was a minister, I was a lawyer working in international development. I worked in the former Soviet countries, developing countries in Africa and South America, and it gave me a deep respect for democracy and for our American Constitution. I remember one visit to Liberia, which I'd visited during my career in international development, when Charles Taylor, the notorious dictator and thug, was still president of Liberia. And then, after I became a minister, I was invited back after the UN peacekeepers came in and ended their civil war. And I saw, as I was driven around the city, I saw signs on the fences, signs everywhere, but especially on the fence outside the Capitol building in Monrovia. The sign said, "Don't use violence. Talk to your legislator." It made me realize how much practice it takes to keep a democracy, how tenuous democracy can be, because violence disrupts democracy. People needed those reminders, those signs, because the violence had been so recent. And the idea that when you're unhappy about something, you simply gather a group of people with guns and use violence to get your way, the Liberian people hoped to put that idea behind and to remember the new paradigm. Talk to your legislator. Talk to your elected representative. Use the democratic process. Back in those days when I was doing this international development work, helping countries create laws that brought them more into democracy, there were two things that were not on my packing list because I didn't need to remember to take them. They were simply integrated into my life. One of those was the little card that has the UU principles on it, because occasionally I would give them away when someone wondered what it meant to be a Unitarian Universalist. But the other thing wasn't tangible. It was the US Constitution, and at least the times that I traveled after the iPhone came out, I carried it on my phone because there's an app for that. Here's the preamble. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. Those opening words, we the people, ordain and establish this Constitution. And our Unitarian Universalist principles start with the words, we, the member congregations of the Unitarian Universalist Association, covenant to affirm and promote. And then there's a list of our 7 principles for ethical living, our values. There's a certain similarity to these two documents and the way they begin. And people don't really expect a national constitution to sound like a set of principles for ethical living. And really it doesn't. And yet they have an underlying similarity because they share a point of view. And it's not surprising. In America, the Unitarians began as Congregationalists, the Church of the Pilgrims, and the Pilgrims were Calvinists. The Unitarians emerged from liberal Congregationalism because people who were Congregationalists heard about the Unitarian movement in Europe, and they thought that reason and interpretation, the use of the human mind, were important to the understanding of Scripture and to the understanding of what it means to be an ethical, moral human being. And the divergence between Calvinism and Unitarianism began with that old idea drawn from the European Unitarians that each person has inherent worth and deserves to be treated with respect. These progressive thinkers drew farther from Calvinism, questioning the unquestionable doctrine. They were sometimes derided as Unitarian in their thinking. At the time of the American Revolution in 1776, and even when the Constitution was offered for ratification in 1787, there were no Unitarian churches by name. That came later in the early 19th century, but there were Unitarians. Thomas Jefferson, who, like some of the other Unitarian sympathizers, attended an Episcopal church, questioned most of conventional Christian theology, especially the miracles, and said that if there had been a Unitarian church nearby, he would have joined it. His good friend James Madison held similar views. And of course, Ben Franklin, who signed both the Declaration and the proposed Constitution, was of a similar mindset. His Quaker faith affirmed the inherent worth of every person. James Madison, you may remember, was the primary drafter of the Constitution for Virginia, and then he went on to be the primary drafter of the U.S. Constitution. And one of the things that mobilized his spirit and his energy to become involved was a conviction that all people should have free expression of their religious ideas. That's a fundamental Unitarian Universalist principle. Thomas Jefferson, Ben Franklin, they were in agreement. But just a word about this friendship between Madison and Jefferson. So while James Madison was at the Constitutional Convention, Thomas Jefferson was in France as an ambassador, and they exchanged these amazing letters about all kinds of things related to the creation of the new Constitution: freedom of religion, freedom of speech, and especially the need to place limitations on the power of the president. They also exchanged notes on areas of scientific interest. Both were fascinated by the differences that they saw between animals in Europe and those in America. They were close enough friends that Madison tried very hard, though he wasn't able to pull it off, to honor Jefferson's request to send him an opossum. The interdependent web of existence. Jefferson believed strongly that an immigrant who came to America with the intent to reside here should be a citizen and should have the right to vote. Now, from the perspective of the 21st century, the founders didn't do a very good job with the right to vote. They struggled with the economic power of slavery in the South and the fact that many of the Southern representatives, including Madison and Jefferson, were slaveholders. It wasn't until after the Civil War that the 14th Amendment guaranteed that all people born in the United States would be citizens, birthright citizenship, an idea that was a tiny seed at the time of the drafting of the Constitution, emerged and flourished after America got past that problem of slavery. In order to retain that institution of slavery, those slaves born in the U.S. couldn't be citizens. So you can see how the early Constitution was flawed and messy, and it took a long time to enshrine that idea of birthright citizenship in the Constitution. But we got there, just as we got to votes for women. This is a work in progress. It's, if you will, a dream, a vision. that the early founders had that they could only bring into being imperfectly, but they did a lot of things right. If American democracy was in the air that the founders breathed during the end of the 18th century, so was Unitarian thinking. And one of the key ideas that American democracy and our UU principles share is a commitment to democracy, to that idea of we the people. In our principles, it says the use of democratic processes in our congregations and in society at large. So one of our 7 UU principles is about democracy and using it in not just our congregations, but in our society. And that idea meshes with the ideas of the founders because no person or group is thought to have a bloodline that makes them inherently more equal and more suited to rule. And no person is allowed to become more equal by force of arms or by abuse of position. This notion that every person has an inherent or natural equality of position is linked to that belief in the inherent worth of every person. This ethical position made our Constitution shift for the first time in the history of humanity from the power of the king to the power of the law. Representative democracy. You know, when the Declaration was signed by the representatives of the 13 colonies, we the people didn't get to vote on revolution. But when the Constitution was proposed, it included an agreement that it wouldn't become law until at least 9 of the 13 colonies had ratified it. And if only those 9 agreed, the Constitution would apply only to those 9. One of the remarkable consequences of inviting the states individually into a ratification process was the number of states that asked ordinary citizens to vote on the Constitution in ratification conventions. The processes weren't all the same, but a number of states relaxed their voting rules so that people who didn't hold property could vote. The Declaration of Independence asserted the proposition that if the king grossly failed to listen to and respect the needs of the people, revolution was the appropriate response. The American Constitution established the idea that citizens didn't need to wait until things got impossibly bad. They didn't need to resort to revolution. They could vote. Don't use violence. Talk to your representative. We vote. So much of what happened in that American Constitution back in the days of the founders at the end of the 18th century was because of the vision that people had, people who resonated with Unitarian ideas. And their vision was something they had to constantly remember and live into and put forth. They argued and talked and persuaded. They made speeches. They published the Federalist Papers. Madison was one of the primary writers in the Federalist Papers. And they explained to people what this idea was, that the people had the power to change their government. This is a precious, and I have come to realize in my life, a fragile idea. It can be eroded if we don't always hold in our minds, in our memory, that vision. If we sit back and do nothing when people ask us to remember things that aren't real. What is reality? In some ways, holding this vision of constitutional democracy in our sight as we move through our lives not only gives us some sense of the ethical life because it respects the inherent worth of every person, but it also helps to bring that vision into reality. It helps to maintain the reality that we live in a constitutional democracy. Do we have to put up signs on walls and fences that say, talk to your representative, that say, remember to vote? Maybe we do. Maybe it's necessary to remind ourselves not to let constitutional democracy slip away, to remind ourselves that we, the people, have inherent worth, and that the government is instituted to serve the welfare of the people, of us, of every person who has inherent worth, every person. And because of our Constitution, our representatives are elected every 2 years. And they, being up for re-election, would be wise to listen to the voice of the people, because we, the people, vote.